Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today, which is on finding your next job in the new world of work, and it's about updating CVs and interview preparation. Before we get to the detail of the webinar, I just want to do a few introductions. So we have Claire Rogers, who is an independent outplacement consultant who will be leading the presentation, and I'm Greg Guilford, the CEO of HR Solutions. We're also supported by Team Arden today, our digital marketing exec, who'll be able to answer any of your technical questions as we go along. There's quite a few of you on the webinar today, but everyone is on mute, obviously, to avoid any disruptions to the speaker. But we do want to encourage you to ask questions as we go through the presentation. And those of you who are not familiar with our webinars, you will see on your screen, hopefully, a GoToWebinar dashboard that looks something like the image on the screen. And there's a little tab there called questions, and it might be closed, but if you expand it, that's where you can ask your question. And when we pause, we will answer as many questions as we can. And if we don't get to your question, we'll come back to you at the end of the webinar. We also like to make these webinars as interactive as possible. So we do have a couple of polls that we'll be running throughout the session. There will be a pop-up that comes up on your screen, and quite simply just tick the option that's most relevant to you. So now that's the housekeeping out of the way, we shall progress with the webinar. I think it's safe to say that coronavirus continues to shape the world and how we all behave. The impact on recruitment experience has been significant, and obviously there are thousands of people in the jobs market currently, and once again it's going to be a very competitive environment. There's also been a decline in face-to-face interviews, which is likely to remain for some time, even though we're beginning to relax some social distancing in the UK. It's likely that face-to-face recruitment is still likely to be some way off. So now more than ever, a candidate needs to ensure that they position their application carefully to ensure it is amongst the increasing large number of applications for every role. This is also the second webinar that Claire has run with us, and we'll share a link to her previous webinar when we come back to you after the webinar. So I'm now going to pass you over to Claire, who's going to take over the rest of the webinar.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you for that introduction. Good morning to everybody. Hope everybody's well this morning. So we're continuing where we were last week, and some of you may have joined in that, or as Greg said, you can listen to it on the recorded version later on. So just to introduce myself, I may be a familiar name to some of you because I used to work on the helpline for HR Solutions, but several years ago, working from the same office that I am at home today, funnily enough. So Work Life is the branding material that a colleague and I use for our outplacements. We work as independent companies and independent consultants in this field, and have done for over 20 years. So much is the same in principle, but obviously a lot of things are changing around us in the world as it is today. So we're going to look at some of the effects of that. So when you look at this slide, I don't want you to panic. I'm not going to rattle on about me here. This is really just to show you the sort of journey that we would take a candidate through on outplacement. So we would have the person be reflecting about the whole of their life, including their work life. And we've just been talking before the call about the difference it is for everybody working at home, even though some of us are used to working at home, and all the mechanics and the things that we've got used to in our houses and doing things remotely. So time to revisit that maybe. To look at your career direction, to look at your strengths. And last week we were looking at my brand in particular, because my brand, if we home in on that, covers the CV, the social media, the networking and the interview. So last week we looked very closely at social media and LinkedIn in particular, and this week we're going to look at CV and interview. I think most people are more familiar with the concept of having a personal branding nowadays, but it's very important if you're going to go out to the market to remind yourself of your professional brand and everything to do with it. So all those circles should be consistent and fit together to put across the image that is authentic and right for you, but also hits the market well. So moving on from there, we're going to have a little poll first of all. Greg, are you able to do this?
Yeah, I'm just going to run the first poll now.
I just want to position it as it's not a test and it's not a right or wrong. The thing with CVs is often opinion and advice, but we in the outplacement market tend to have one view.
So on your screen, you should see the poll, which is how many pages is the ideal UK market CV? And we've got the options 1, 2, and 3. We've got about 73% of you have voted so far, so I'm just going to give it a few more seconds. Okay, most of you have voted now, so I'm just going to close that poll. I'm going to share that results to the audience. So the main answer was 2 pages, which was 86%, and then 1 was 14%. So nobody opted for 3 pages.
Good.
So I'm going to hide that poll. And then we've got another poll straight away, which I'm going to share now, which is which of the following should have top priority for inclusion on your CV? And we've got photo, hobbies, LinkedIn, italicized text, and referenced contacts. You can only choose one of those, so which one is the top priority? So about 70% of you have voted so far, so I'm just going to give it a few more seconds. Okay, so most of you have voted now. So LinkedIn Earl has 93% as the top priority, quite clearly there, and then 7% reference contacts, and nobody went for any of the other options. So I'll just close those polls for you.
Thank you, Greg. That's interesting, isn't it? So I would go along with the bulk of you, definitely. As I said, no right or wrong answers, and certainly with the pages, we did stress the UK market because you'll find different trends in different countries. The one-pager can be quite popular. I noticed some of you put down for that, and is in some fields, like I believe venture capitalists will only look at one page, but generally we talk about 2 pages. I remember someone coming to me with 8 pages. So there are still people out there that are thinking a lot more than 3. So that's great that you guys are all on the right track there. And the same for the top priority for inclusion of CV. There was a little flurry of big photos, and then I think people began to realize that actually there's no space for a photo on a CV. That's where it should be put across to LinkedIn. And the link to LinkedIn is the key thing that you should be including on your CV. So that should have the top priority, as most of you said. The reference contacts, I would suggest nowadays we don't put that on. From my point of view, it's normally, I would say it's a waste of space because it's something that will happen later on anyway. So I would definitely leave that one off. Hobbies. There's a discussion to be had about hobbies, and I would just use the word relevance for that. Okay, thank you all for input on that. So let's look at what actually is the CV and what's the job of the CV. I like to think that we're all in sales mode when you're heading towards the job market, and the CV therefore is your brochure. And I think it's good to think of that because you would understand that it needs to be appealing, and it needs to be succinct, and it probably will only manage to show the highlights of what you've done. because for most people there's too much to put on to cover everything that you've ever done. So think of it as your brochure all the time. Your gateway to an interview invite, for those of you who might not have been on the job market for a while, it's quite an achievement to be invited to an interview, and a short list will definitely be very short compared to the amount of applications or CVs that have been considered before invites go out for interviews. So it's really important, and I have seen people where the application, the vacancy, the role, everything is just them and they're dead excited about it, and somehow they're not invited to an interview, which means the CV hasn't done the job of putting across what it should do. So it's key that we get it right. But I'll talk a lot later on, but it's important that you understand it shouldn't just be one version. So evidence is the key in the next point here. It needs to show evidence of your achievements, and achievements being putting what I call your proud hat on. So reflecting, but with pride, rather than just about the job role. So no longer do we worry about job responsibilities. You might bash them out on a Word doc for yourself just to be sure that you've covered the job, but then you need to move it on to make them into achievement statements. At the interview, they ask for evidence nowadays. Many of you will probably be aware of that. Questions like, tell me a time, give me an example. So it is all about evidence. So we want to do the same thing on the CV. The CV should reflect your brand, your style, as well as your experience. I'm working with a lady at the moment who's in marketing, and her specialty is copywriting. So that's so important for her style to go across, as you would imagine. There are services where you can pay for your CV to be done for you, and as well as charging a lot of money, I'm very cynical about them because it tends not to reflect you, and people come unstuck somewhere along the process, probably in a humiliating way at interview if that's the case. Putting the whole thing together, reviewing it and reminding yourself of how good you are and what you've achieved can be a really good boost, particularly if someone's been through what I would call a tricky period in the lead up to their job hunting. So see that as a process in itself that is going to be useful rather than a chore, and certainly not something just that was going to be quickly done on a Sunday afternoon. The copy, the style, the vocabulary, the achievements, everything needs to have impact. I should have put in brackets without being corny maybe, because often we're very concerned not to be conceited or to be corny, though very rarely are we in this country, I have to say. We normally have to up the ante for the pride rather than anything else. It is a document, but for the lady that talked about with the copy and the marketing, she's had to do one in a special format to go forward for a particular role. But normally it would just be a question of that document looking appealing in terms of balance and white space and the right font, so not too small. So it's the content, it's the skills that stand out rather than anything fancy about it. Your CV is going to be your guide and your prop, and also your brochure at the interview. So we're going to assume at the interview that you have one in front of you as your prop, and the interviewer has another copy of the same CV, obviously. That's a huge boost, again, to confidence at interview. So the hard work that goes into putting a CV together is actually interview preparation as well. So I've put here some do's and don'ts, and again, you might find amongst your friends or family or colleagues that people have slightly different views. CV is a very good networking tool, so it's great to have those conversations, but just remember you don't have to act on everything that everybody says. It's your document at the end of the day and you make a decision. The do's and don'ts here are very much what we in the outplacement field would suggest. So we suggest you have a database to build varied versions. For those who are technical, database might be the wrong word. It might be better to think of a bank of material. You could do it on Word, you could do it on Excel. In the old days, or often now if you're sitting in the garden, it would be just pencil and notepad. So a database to build varied versions. you also then don't have that thing of cutting elements out and feeling like you're binning things that you've achieved. All you're doing is carrying into a template. You need to know your audience. So what sort of people are you talking to? And this is obviously very difficult when you're on LinkedIn, because we could expect all sorts of people to be looking at your profile. But hopefully when you're going to send out a CV, you are aware of who is going to be looking at it and for what purpose. So it's really important to constantly be remembering who your audience is in terms of technical knowledge, abbreviations, simplicity of terminology, everything. You're going to promote highlight skills and strengths of your career on this 2-page document. So it can't possibly cover it all. So just think of those best bits if you like. Find out what's relevant. So websites to organizations, Glassdoor, there's all sorts of things on social media that will give you a feel to the organization if it's not somewhere that you're very familiar with, that will help you see what might be relevant or not to their needs and what they're thinking or interested in. Do stick to business mode. So I tend to say it's not necessarily grammatically correct Queen's English. And I found that when I'm with people who have come from abroad. I remember a bunch of Dutch businessmen, for instance, who found it very difficult to cut something down because they were very keen to get the grammar correct. So I say think of a slide on PowerPoint. When you're using bullet points, it's not going to be Queen's English, but it's acceptable in the business world. We've discussed 2 pages, so we move on to the don'ts. So don't just add an update to an old version. I think we've all been fallen to that old trick in the past. Pull out an old document and just add the last job. But actually, it always needs a complete overhaul to put things in perspective. And you will have moved on, however long ago that last version was done. You'll be surprised at how much things have changed. I'm hoping that the lockdown period will have brought out some skills and strengths that people are adding to their CVs right now. So don't have one CV for all. Each time you're going to revisit it and tailor it. So what's going to be relevant for this particular version, for this particular role, and for this particular reader. Don't send out without comments on the match. That's the match between you and what they're looking for. So help the reader. It doesn't have to be a complete covering letter. It might just be a couple of comments on the opening email to tempt them to see why your skills match what they're looking for. So be sure to add that comment. Don't use job description terms. So as I mentioned, job responsibilities, in the old days, we used to have 2 sections, responsibilities and then a tiny bit of achievements. And suddenly we realized it was the achievements we wanted. We don't need to know about the job. We need to know the elements you feel proud of, in particular, that have a relevance to what we're looking for. Don't adopt mediocre terms or vocabulary. Again, a bit of a British trait. So put your hat on that allows you to be a bit more, say, American, and think of a wider vocabulary to make it more interesting. Job descriptions tend to use the same sort of terms. So really question it. What was I doing here? Was I streamlining it? Was I simplifying it? So really, particularly the verbs and adverbs, go over them again and again and go for variety, but to really paint a clear picture in words to the reader. Don't therefore assume the reader's knowledge. So be very careful with abbreviations. I think sometimes people feel it could be patronizing if they're talking to an expert, but actually we need to assume that the expert may have drafted in some help, or one of the key things about CVs nowadays is it may go through electronic scanning, in which case abbreviation might not be picked up or recognized. So that helps people move past that barrier possibly. Okay. Yep.
Yeah, I'm ready. Are you ready?
Ready for the next one? Yep.
Yep. So we've got another poll for you. So This poll is about, can you tell us when you're asked at an interview to tell you about yourself, what would you choose? So on the screen, you've got 4 options. So one is give a lengthy personal and professional biography, talk about your children, pets, love of Star Wars, talk in detail through your CV, and highlight key strengths and experiences. So you can just choose the one that's most relevant to you. So about 65% of you have voted, so just give it a few more seconds. Okay, I think a few people are taking time to think, but we're at 82, so I'm going to start to close the poll. I'm going to share the results. So 86% chose highlight key strengths and experiences, and then 14% talk in detail through your CV, and the other options didn't receive any votes at all, even though everyone loves Star Wars. Okay, I'll pass you back.
Okay, good. Thank you for that. I think the key is in number 3, the word detail, talk in detail through your CV. So tell me about yourself. The alternative way of putting that question is often talk me through your CV, but the detail is the worry there, because we wouldn't want you to be talking in great detail. That tends to panic the interviewer that this is going to take too long, and it goes into life story mode where you're talking through right from your education up to the current day in huge detail. Again, if we pick out the highlights, so question 4 was a bit of a giveaway, or answer 4 with the word highlight there. So it's key strengths and experiences. So you might be talking through your past. You may want to do it in the reverse order, coming from your graduation or school or whatever, but obviously it needs to be on fast forward, because we need to talk about the key strengths and the match that make you the right candidate for that job. So that's going to be your opening stance, and I highly recommend that somebody practices a tell me about yourself answer before every interview, and probably pitching that at about 2 minutes material, so the longest answer that you're going to be able to give. Personally, I think that question's often put at interviews as just an icebreaker. It's a bit of politeness, if you like, to settle the candidate and to allow the interviewer to remind themselves why they invited that person in. But it makes a huge difference to how the interview starts. Like a presentation, if you have a good start, the candidate, you are going to feel so much more positive about it, but you will also lift the energy and interest of the interviewer who's thinking, oh yeah, I remember this one. Oh yeah, I was really interested in that and I want to hear more about this. And the energy in the room will lift considerably. So very, very important, and an easy one to prepare. So a little bit more on interview preparation. I sometimes suggest that we get rid of the word interview and say, I've got a meeting. If you're going to a meeting with a new supplier or a new client, a new customer, then this is how you would prepare yourself. So the preparation needs to be exactly the same, in that you have particular points to put across, even if the agenda is going to be run from the other side of the table. You have things that you're looking for as well. So it's very much a professional two-way discussion. So the questions you're going to put to them, the research you're going to do beforehand, etc. Think of it as a meeting. Practice a good introduction. So as I said, the tell me about yourself is really, really important. Think of it as a presentation, and a good presentation would have to have a start, a middle and an ending. So a great start is a boost to everybody all round and will help it flow better right from the beginning. So key area for rehearsal there, and actually rehearsing it out loud. Preparing for key question areas, knowing, as I said earlier, that they're looking for evidence. So what are the key question areas going to be? They may give you some information about this in advance, but if not, looking at the advert or the role, or just generally looking at the organization. If I said someone was to go for an interview with Marks and Spencer's tomorrow, I'm sure there's some key skill areas that we could all come up with straight away that we suspect they would be looking for from that culture. So what are they going to be looking for? And am I ready? Have I rejigged all my material in my mind away from the chronological view into key skill areas so that I can ask those questions? And sometimes the interview will be structured very, very clearly such that they'll actually say, now we're going to move on to the area to discuss your technical skills, for instance. So be prepared for that middle bit to be giving evidence, and it's quite easy nowadays to try and predict what sort of questions those might be, thankfully. I mentioned vetting your verbal vocabulary, so getting rid of anything that's a bit neutral or a bit mediocre, but hopefully you've done that on the CV anyway. So anything that's to do with I ran, I worked, maybe liaised, we need to pump these things up a bit. So we're not going to tell any untruths, but we are going to polish up your language. So you're going to revisit again and again the CV version till you're happy, and then hopefully you'll practice those words out loud so that interview you're using the very same words, and it's nice and strong. We also just need to keep a check on our body language, and obviously it's quite different nowadays with interviews being done over Zoom and other modes like that. So the old webcam, how's it working, what's your positioning, what difference does it make, etc. I've recently bought one of those big lean over lamps, and it's just what you shouldn't do when you're going to put a webcam up, because there's a very big danger that it looks like I'm sitting under a hooded hairdryer or something. So your body language, your facial expression, etc., how does that come across on a webcam as well as in person? They'll be trying to gauge some sort of chemistry, which is so much harder when you're not there in person, isn't it? So let them not be distracted by your background or bad habits in your body language. So adjust talking too much. Often nerves affect people in different ways, and for many that means racing off at tangents and talking in far too much detail. So hence why I zoomed in on the word detail in the poll question back there. So you tend to need to give a little answer to start with, and then find that they would dig and encourage you to say more if they wanted to. Very few people don't say enough nowadays. That tends to be kept to sort of the school leaver stage, where people are too monosyllabic and need to be encouraged to say more. So as I've just said, understand how nerves affect you. Nerves are a good thing. They give you energy, it's adrenaline, and you just need to know how to calm the poor aspects of it and direct the good aspects of it so that you come across as energetic and enthusiastic. Try to be adaptable, and this keeps happening, and it happens just as much through virtual interviews as in person, where somebody will say, it went quite well, but I was really thrown at the beginning because of this or because of that. I had a guy last week who did a virtual interview, and there was somebody in the UK, as quite often is the case, but someone had asked to join from the States, and the person in the States, my candidate thought she was on a train, and it threw him, is what he said. There was somebody sitting right next to the person who was interviewing, who was nothing to do with it, like another passenger on a train. So all the COVID stuff comes into play. Where on earth is this person with people so closely packed together on a train? Can they hear what I'm saying? All sorts of stuff obviously flew into his mind and just threw him off balance. Whereas really, he should have been focusing on the interview process as normal, and perhaps focusing on the person that was doing the one-to-one and paying less attention to the one that was remote, if it was going to be his distraction. So all sorts of things can get in the way to allow yourself to be thrown. And again, working at home, we've talked this morning about all these distractions that happen. The post person, the parcel arriving, somebody in the background of the call that you're talking about. All sorts of things can happen. So try just to be human and adapt, and don't let it throw you off balance, I would say. Hard to prepare for that, except kind of opening your mind that all sorts of things could happen. So more on preparation. Know really well what your message is. Know your brand and know your skills and your strengths. So that is your core message, and it's key that you understand that. Often people spend too much time in the preparation about the organization and not enough about themselves. When they're asked quite basic questions, they can again be thrown off balance, whereas actually you're coming to present yourself, so you must know yourself very, very well. Prepare very thoroughly in order to do that. As I said before, I would suggest it's as if there's a presentation. So every aspect of it is run through and hopefully done verbally out loud. You don't need a skilled interviewer at home to practice with. You just get them to ask you one question, like tell me about yourself, and off you go. And obviously you can practice with yourself. You can record yourself and all sorts nowadays to make it more realistic for you. Do ask ahead for the format. Quite often they tell you more nowadays than they used to in the past. So they might actually say you would meet so-and-so and this person, this is their job title. Obviously my guy wasn't told that this lady was joining and that she might be on a train from the States. But competencies and behavioural competency interviews are quite common, and they will often say that in advance. Some places will actually ask you to prepare in a certain way as well. In your preparation, I like you to think of what's the worst thing that can happen, what am I fearful that they ask me about, or that people have often said to me, I throw my hands around too much, I gesticulate too much. What other bad habits might you have? Sometimes it's language, ums and ahs, as I've just done, all sorts of things. So think about what is it that you're fearful of, and how can you try and deal with that and put it in perspective. Again, dealing with the nerves is another one. Looking at the culture and recognizing what style of culture is best for you is a key one nowadays. A lot of organizations are very proud of the way that they work, not just what they do, and they're very keen to hear how that fits with you. That would also relate to the values of the organization and your personal values, which can be a question that might throw an individual. So work out theirs and yours and how, again, there's a fit, so that you can see how the two would come together and be ready to put that across throughout the interview, but you might be asked specifically as well. I mentioned earlier, I'm not ever asking anyone to make anything up. Even to exaggerate anything, you will get caught out. So be thoroughly authentic, but we just want the best of you. The polished up version is what we want. I've mentioned a couple of things already about the difference between the live interview and the virtual one. So a lot of practice setting up and a lot of things to think about all around you, as well as focusing on your words and what you would actually say. And a key question is always put to me about what do I wear for an interview? And nowadays, perhaps that's said even more. There is that joke about the, I can't remember, there is a term for it, isn't there, for the top dressing, when you've got your leggings on your bottom half and your work mode's on the top in the top half. A little bit risky in case you had to stand up for anything and the webcam was on. But I had someone last week who had polished his shoes, especially for the interview, which to him was important that he felt right. So I think you need to be comfortable, but if you need the polished shoes on, then go ahead and polish your shoes, even if you're at home, then that's absolutely fine. No doubt in the questions that we're going to do at the end, there might be some what to wear points as well. So last week I found I had predicted a lot of the questions as I had talked. So Greg's going to be looking at the question box and seeing what you're asking. So we probably have a few minutes to address some of those.
Okay, thanks, Claire. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. So some of them relate to the CV and some of them relate to obviously the interview. So I might jump around a little bit, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So one question is, I want to know how to work my CV to attract senior positions as part of my next career move. So looking for a step up, basically, to mid-manager level to senior director. Do you have any advice of what they should be focusing on when creating their CV?
Well, the good news is that we tend to think that people are always on the up, and we tend to think a career is an upward route. So people expect you to be looking upwards. So that's the first thing. And then I would try and bring out the elements of perhaps management you haven't done yet thoroughly in terms of your job responsibilities, but maybe you've had a taste of it. So for instance, if you wanted to do people management or the next role involved people management and you hadn't in the past, then look for areas where you had influenced, persuaded, led, directed, etc., and pull those forward. So you may not have had people as direct reports, but you may have been responsible for getting results through certain people, which actually sometimes is harder. They may have been external suppliers, for instance. So think of examples and just be perhaps a bit more clever with your examples to be positioning to show why you're ripe and ready for this next role. Okay, that's what I would say. But actually the opposite is almost harder if someone's looking for a job where they're looking for a smaller job, because the assumption is always there's no challenge in it, you'd be bored. So remember, they do want to see that you'd be interested and there's a challenge in a new job, so you don't have to have done everything before.
Yeah, just to kind of add to that, I think if you're in a role that doesn't necessarily allow you to demonstrate those that you're ready for the next level, then you can always think about volunteering to get that experience, either in a charity, a school governor or something like that. So you could get a bit more experience, sort of non-work related, to be able to demonstrate you have that capability.
Yep, and leadership
Um,
often comes from things like sports, doesn't it? So
yeah.
that's when I mentioned before I don't like hobbies particularly on the CV, but that's where I would say if you were a coach in a sporting capacity, that's going to say something as well.
Yeah, definitely. Then just jumping to some of the questions around interview. So you talked about thinking about the questions that you might be asked, and I think it's fair to say you could do a Google and find some stock questions that you can anticipate, but one of the ones that typically always comes up is tell us about your strengths and tell us about your weaknesses. So one of the questions is about how honest should you be with your weaknesses?
I think you should be honest, but obviously you don't want to be revealing something that is going to get in the way of that job. I mean, hopefully you won't be going for a job that's completely wrong for your skill set, but bear in mind what's relevant to the job. You should be, if you think of past appraisals, I always think that's a good thing to do. If you've had appraisals, if you can think of the things that have come up as your, if I put my ex-HR hat on, it used to be development areas, wouldn't it, rather than weaknesses. So what have you learned about yourself, and how do you work with that? So for myself, I would always say my huge weakness is numeracy. And although I've passed the relevant exams and I've done Excel up to high levels, it goes in one ear and out the other, and I never retain it. So I would always want to persuade people of how I deal with that in a work situation, which is normally to make very good friends with the finance department and make sure they check everything that I would do that's to do with finance or figures.
Yep.
So you can be human is what I'm saying. So be honest enough to be human. Does that answer it, do you think,
Yeah.
Greg? Anything
Yeah,
else
no,
to
that's
add?
fine. I think you definitely don't say I don't have any. You want to have sort of acknowledge that you're human. You do have some, but acknowledging them, you've also saying this is how I deal with it, rather than just say I have this weakness and that's it. Because
Yeah.
people want to know that you acknowledge it and have a way to deal with it. So over this kind of COVID period, we've still been recruiting for some of our clients. and we've obviously done quite a few webinars now. And I think one of the questions that we see candidates asking quite commonly now is about how did you treat your staff during COVID and lockdown? So that's, I think, a common question that candidates ask the interviewer. But is there any other questions that you think a candidate should be thinking about asking to show that they're interested in the role, and sort of demonstrate their higher capability or suitability for the role?
So the questions you ask of them, I think is key, and I didn't address it much in the presentation because it's a huge section. Sure. I always think that if the rest of it is predictable, this bit isn't so predictable. It's turning the presentation over to you, and it's your turn to take the agenda, if you like. And every question you ask will reflect how you think. So they will be judging you on what you ask. So I always say, don't ask the mechanics of the role. Don't ask about the pension or the parking space or the bonus or anything like that. That should be outside of the interview. You should be asking questions that show your skills and strengths, show your interest, and things that are genuine to you.
Yeah.
So,
and just, sorry.
Yeah, not clever, open, interested, keen, done of homework. But just kind of, I suggest, particularly about culture, when going back to your COVID question, is just getting beneath the veneer of an interview without being controversial. And they really need practicing at home to make sure that you put those questions across nice and positively. Yeah,
so one sort of second part to that is someone's asking about, well, I've done my homework, but I don't want to go to the interview and ask a lot of questions to show that I'm interested, but make it come across that I haven't actually done my research. So I think for that, it's about spinning it to say you have done your research. So I saw on your website you do X with charities. What's your plan for this year's? Kind of shows two things, doesn't it? That you're interested in, that you've done your research, and so you kind of hoping that you would stick in the interviewer's mind a bit more.
Yeah.
It's about turning what the research you've done into a question to put forward that you've done your research, but to with an aim that you get an answer that you're looking for. I think, whilst this webinar is about helping people find a new role, there will be a lot of people who find themselves unemployed in this situation, but I would stress to everybody, you still want to find a job that you're happy with, not just take any job. So just through the interview process and when you're applying for jobs, really, you spend a lot of time at work that you want to be sure that that's the right role for you as well. And I appreciate there will be some pressures to have income, but definitely take the time to find a job that you think is right for you and a company that's right for you as well. And if you haven't done that through your research, then definitely use the interview questioning to make sure that's right for you.
Yeah, absolutely. So the culture and the values will help you feel you're in the right place, definitely.
Yeah, and sort of on that theme as well, obviously with COVID, there might be some questions about job security. Why is the role available? Is it a new role? Those kind of questions will try to give you a bit of understanding about why this role exists and whether you're replacing somebody as well. Might give you a bit more confidence. One of the other questions was, if all roles we have had are similar, how can we adjust it for a new career path? So I think they're talking about the CV in that scenario. So I think maybe somebody who's been in administration and wants to get into HR, how could they kind of make that transition?
Without going into a lot of detail, when I'm helping people one-to-one, I use two formats of CVs. And if you think you may have seen one of these, the alternative would be a skills-based CV. So instead of your CV being in chronological, reverse historical order, then you collect your bullet points and present them under skills headings. And then we worry less about the job role you're in, and the reader sees more clearly the match between the skills you've been using and the role that's on offer. So for a sector change or a job role change of some significance, that I would use a different layout, basically.
Yeah, so that's great. So basically having a couple of CVs available for different roles that you're applying for. Great. Well, I think that's all the time we've got for questions. If there is any others that we haven't covered, we will come back to them after the webinar.
Okay. Thank you very much, Greg. Thank you to everyone for listening and for your questions.
Yep. So thank you, Claire. It's obviously the second one, but we may circle back and ask you to do some more if we get a lot of interest for this topic. So any further questions, you can email us at inquiries@hrsolutions-uk.com, and we will come back to you. So just to remind everybody that obviously we've been running quite a few webinars throughout COVID and lockdown. Might have to find a new word for that soon as we come out of lockdown. But so there are some more webinars that we've got on the screen for you. Oh, it would help if I'm sharing my screen, I think. There we go. So this week we've got Equality, Diversity and Inclusion in Action, and that's with the Bedford College Group. So they'll be talking about how they've addressed equality and diversity and inclusion within their college. And then we've got Managing Diversity in the Workplace next week. The Future of Work and New Employment Practices is dealing with the return to work post-COVID and how we see employment practices changing. And we've also got Conflict Resolution, which is to do with mediation in September. Please do check back because we are adding new webinars all the time. This is just our plan as it stands now, but there may be one or two added in August and September as well, so please do check back. And the link is at the bottom, www.hrsolutions-uk.com/upcoming webinars. So we have recorded this webinar today as well, and we will put this on our website later today. But on our webinars archives page, you will also be able to access all of our previous webinars as well. Like I said, we've done quite a few throughout this period. So if you do have some time and you want to have a look at them, then please visit our website for a bit more detail. And we will send a link on the follow-up email from this webinar as well. So that just leaves me to say thank you once again to Claire. Hope everyone found it useful, and it will be available to watch again, and the link will be sent after the webinar as well. But hopefully you've got everything you need out of the webinar. So thank you again, Claire, and I'm going to now close the webinar.
Thanks very much, Greg.